Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It is thrilling to see how many people who are attending this year's conference. I understand it's a record number of participants. That's a very, very good sign. And that's a very good sign at a time where also some people suggest that environmental concerns, climate change, all these kind of things, that has disappeared from the agenda. Now we are busy having an economic crisis. Couldn't we just wait to discuss climate issues until the crisis has been solved? Obviously, the answer to that is very much a no. Unfortunately, the climate change crisis was not so kind as to disappear while we were busy handling the economic crisis. So it's very much still here. And I'm not going to tell you how much it is here, but just a few examples. Remind yourself of the pictures, the floodings in Pakistan some months back. Remind what we have seen in recent weeks and months from Thailand. It's not just because of climate change, but climate change is definitely making it worse. Flooding huge parts of Thailand, among them really a lot of their rice harvest, meaning that the rice harvest of Thailand this year will be reduced by 20%. Interesting, as Thailand is the world's largest rice producer. I could also mention Central America. I could mention the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa, there are many reasons for the starvation there now, the hunger situation, but climate change is making it worse because climate change functions as a threat multiplier. We can also take from our own European area, very, very dry summer in the southern part of Europe, having dire consequences in Spain and the southern part of France. Even I understand from the wine harvest. In eastern parts of Europe, heat records were set like never before in the eastern part of Europe. In Denmark, in Poland, in Sweden, we saw very heavy precipitation, and a lot of cost came with that. So just to say, climate change is not disappearing. It is as urgent as ever. It's still here. And I was rather impressed to see recently a poll that we did in the European Commission showing clearly that the citizens of Europe actually understand this. It showed that almost 9 out of 10 Europeans think climate change is one of the most serious problems the world is facing, and to more of half of the respondents, climate change is even a more serious problem than the economic crisis. And then to this, but can't we just wait to deal with it until we have managed the economic crisis? I think that you will be aware of the report from the International Energy Agency coming out 2 weeks ago, the World Energy Outlook, saying that actually we only have 5 or 6 years back before we risk having locked in our energy systems for decades in a way that will make it close to impossible actually to address climate change in the way we should be doing it. We have also seen a lot of other reports recently, and I believe that it's very clear that if we don't change our policies now, within a few years, we would have wasted a lot of money. It's not just a challenge for the climate, it is also going to be a challenge for our economy. Last year, 2010, we saw the biggest jump in emissions globally than we have seen ever. And we made new record high CO2 emissions. So, to quote the International Energy Agency, delaying action is a false economy. For every dollar of investment in cleaner technology that is avoided, you could say saved, before 2020, more than 4 times as much would need to be spent after 2020 to compensate for the increased emissions. That is a quote from the International Energy Agency, of which you can say a lot, but hardly that it's sort of the front runners of the revolution. So I think we can count on this. Just last week, the IPCC published its special report on the risks of extreme events and disasters, linking climate change to a number of worrying trends. As global emissions keep increasing, we are increasingly feeling the consequences, for instance, through more frequent or more severe extreme weather events. And here I think we are at a very key point. Sometimes when we discuss what to do and what not to do in politics, what to invest in, what not to invest in, people tend to believe that if just we continue business as usual, that will cost us nothing. That is very, very untrue when we talk about climate change. To continue business as usual will come with a very, very high economic price. Damages and losses related to flooding, storms, and heat waves in Europe alone last year were estimated as more than 11 billion euros. So don't believe that business as usual is a cheap option. Now we need to act now while we still have a choice. Now when the crisis is inviting us to look into new ways of economic growth. This is the right time to start making the transition to a climate-friendly, low-carbon economy. Green growth will create new businesses, new markets, new services, and with all of these things also come new jobs. So this is precisely not an obstacle to growth. It's one of the pathways we need to pursue in order to create the growth that we need in order to exit the crisis. Let me set out how the EU looks at green growth and what we do to support and stimulate green growth. I believe that it is no coincidence that EU has proven by our own example that over the last more or less 20 years, we had an increase in our GDP of around 40%, an increase in our manufacturer output around 36%, and yet at the same time, we managed to reduce emissions by 17%. So I think that we are living proof that climate protection is not synonymous with deindustrialization. It requires actually reindustrialization, doing things differently, smarter, more efficiently. That is what it should be all about. One of our primary concerns is to develop climate policies that are environmentally efficient in a way that will not hamper economic growth in Europe, but which leaves companies maximum flexibility to cut emissions at least cost. Our flagship policy instrument there is the EU's emissions trading scheme, the ETS, for the heavy polluting industrial and power generating installations, which amount for about 45% of Europe's emissions. Norway is also a part of the EU ETS. By putting a price on carbon, we incentivize companies to cut emissions. Targets are equally important. Targets help create certainty, predictability in what may otherwise appear as an uncertain and risky future to investors. On this basis, companies can decide which long-term investments are required and avoid locking in carbon emissions for the future. This isn't just theory. We can see the effects in very real terms. For instance, analysis by the European Patent Office and UNEP has shown that patenting rates in clean energy technologies significantly outpaced those related to fossil technologies after adoption of the Kyoto Protocol back in 1997. It's just one example. Some of our targets have directly contributed to improving the competitiveness of European industries. I could mention many examples, time will not permit that, but for instance, in my home country, Denmark, it goes without discussion that many of the regulatory things that were set up in the environmental field in the 80s and the 90s, targets for developing renewables and so on and so forth, made a very, very significant contribution to Denmark today being the world leader when it comes to wind energy. At the European level, we have seen when we set targets for instance, CO2 emissions from cars, announce it many years in advance, and push our companies to make the necessary innovation, we can see that it actually helps. It stimulates innovation in the whole sector, and it keeps our car industry, our auto manufacturers, competitive. So targets are necessary, and they have proven that they can both deliver necessary emission cost and boost innovation. And thanks to its target-driven policies, we are actually in the European Union on track to achieve our 20% emissions cut by the end of this decade. We are also on track to meet our renewables target for 2020. And that is despite of the crisis. Because if there is one lesson we have learned in Europe, and that others could also learn from, also in the international negotiations, that is that targets help governments and politicians to stay focused on the challenges. That is probably where they have their very, very big quality. This is only a first step, though, our targets for 2020. We need, in the developed part of the world, to reduce our emissions by the middle of this century in the dimension of 80 to 95%. That is what science tells us to do. That is what we in Europe and also in Norway, I understand, have promised to do. And in order to do so, we really need innovative, low-carbon technologies in transport, in buildings, in the energy sector, in manufacturing, in our homes, all over the spectrum. Therefore, the Commission this spring, despite the fact that we have a lot of other things to attend to in the Commission right now, but we presented a low-carbon roadmap for 2050. That was exactly in order to give the predictability, show what would be the most cost-efficient pathway to these very ambitious targets, and for instance, where would we need to be in 2030 and in 2040 in order to do the transition in the most cost-efficient way. I know that some of you who are investors will know that 2020, that is just around the corner. Many of you will already be looking beyond 2020, and that's of course why in the target setting we must do the same. We also, despite the fact that we said we should do things in all sorts of sectors and not in the also in the non-ETS sector, buildings, agriculture, and transport in Europe, we also set one more new way of thinking in Europe. We said, shouldn't we do relatively more when it comes to energy efficiency and climate-friendly solutions? Shouldn't we do relatively more in Europe itself instead of investing in China, India, Brazil through the clean development mechanism and things like that, through offsetting? I know that this is a very hot discussion also in Norway, but what we suggested from the Commission is that relatively more of the efforts in the future in Europe should be done by investing in our own energy efficient solutions, in our own jobs, in retrofitting pipes and buildings and what have we, instead of sending the money through projects, yes, but sending the money to our competitors so that we basically invest in them being able to make the transition. We believe we must have a major increase in our own investments in low-carbon technologies, in innovative solutions, renewables, but also CCS, where Norway, of course, has a very clear front-runner position. We also in Europe support investments in R&D and the deployment of innovative low-carbon technologies. One of the ways we do this is through selling 300 million allowances, and the revenues from that goes back to supporting member states' new renewables technologies and CCS, just to mention one example how from the European level we can actually make member states address more of these challenges. Also in the next budget period, from 2014 to 2020, the Commission intends to increase considerably the money available for low-carbon energy infrastructure and R&D, and overall we have said from the Commission side that at least 20% of the whole European budget must somehow be spent through structural funds, agricultural subsidies, and what have we, in order to enhance in order to promote that we can actually achieve our carbon targets. The required investments should not be seen as mere costs. New money will be pumped into our domestic energy and manufacturing industries, thus creating new opportunities for technological development and growth and jobs. Because here is also a competitive aspect. The bank, HSBC, has calculated that last year, global green revenues grew by 7% to an all-time record of more than 400 billion euros. That's more than the whole Swiss GDP. Shouldn't we take care in Europe that we really get our share of that growing cake? That is why we must keep at the front post here. According to news reports, China intends to invest around 230 billion euros in low-carbon technologies and energy efficiency in the next 5 years. It's already the world's biggest producer of solar panels. I think they now have 4 among the top 10 within the wind companies in the world, and so on and so forth. Competition is really growing. It's good news, you could say. Thanks to Chinese investments, for example, solar panels have become 60% cheaper over the last 3 years, which has put solar power for the first time on a competitive footing with the retail price of electricity in a number of sunny countries. However, Europe must act to ensure it maintains its leading position in green technologies if we want to have our share of new markets, technological developments, and jobs. As I said, this is also why we think we should do more in Europe in the energy efficiency area. I will not go into details here, but this is probably one of the areas where we have the biggest potential and where we could do a lot more in Europe, and that would save us a lot of money that we are pouring into today. Middle East oil regimes, Russian gas, and so on and so forth. Some of you could say yes, and Norwegian oil and gas, and that's very fine, and you don't have to worry because we will have to use a lot of that also in the future. But we could actually spend our money wiser if we addressed energy efficiency much more systematically. Another key pillar is renewables. So far, Europe is still in the lead. We are home to 23 of the world's 25 largest photovoltaic power stations. European companies have developed a lot of state-of-the-art renewable energy technologies and are creating real economic added value with these. Norway's own Renewable Energy Corporation remains one of the world's largest players in the solar industry and employs now more than 4,000 people. We have many examples, Siemens, Acciona, many big companies in Europe who has proven that this is something that can create jobs. Actually, over the last 5 years, we have created 300,000 new jobs in Europe in the field of renewables. I just wonder how many other sectors that could claim that. And we can see that the potential up to 2020, if we stick to our targets, which we of course must, that is that we will create an additional 1.5 million jobs. However, there of course is no doubt that the current crisis makes things difficult, also for renewables. As for almost any other purpose, financing is increasingly hard to get at these days, and lack of access to finance risks jeopardizing our ambitions if we don't find new sources and ways of mobilizing it. A renewed effort to boost investments will be needed if we want to meet our 20% renewable target by the end of this decade. This includes upgrading our grids to smart grids with better interconnections and large-scale storage. Norway's hydropower contribution to the European power network is vulnerable, as it can provide backup for wind power generation, not least in the scenario with further large-scale development of offshore wind installations, notably in the northern seas. So sustainability is at the heart of the EU's growth strategy, and we have got both the tools and targets to make the transition to a green, low-carbon economy. And let me end up here saying a few words then about the international negotiations, as was mentioned in the introduction, because we are not sitting idle in Europe, just waiting for one day the international negotiations miraculously to present this international legally binding deal that we need. As I've just tried to emphasize, we are doing many things in Europe already, and so we must. But it goes without saying that the world will not be able to stay below the 2 degrees that the leaders pledged in Copenhagen in 2009 unless we actually get everybody on board and everybody commits. I know that when Durban starts, there will be one big political issue. Couldn't Europe and Norway and Switzerland and a few more be so kind as to take a second commitment period? Then Durban could be a great success. No, that would definitely not make Durban a great success if that was to be the only outcome of Durban. Why is that? It's because EU is accounting for 11% of global emissions, plus Norway, plus New Zealand maybe, plus Switzerland, plus a few more. We could bring it to maybe 15% of global emissions. We have said in Europe, as you have said in Norway, we are ready to take a second commitment period. But there must be some conditions attached to it. Conditions related to the environmental integrity, but also conditions only on the condition that others tell us when are they coming on board. Because what is the point in making the bridge to the future, between now and the future, if nobody follows us over this bridge? Focus must also be on the 85 or whatever percentage it is for the remaining countries. When will they start also to commit in the same legal form as the rest of us commits? That is sort of the thinking we have in EU prior to Durban. If we only said without conditions we take a second commitment period, what do you think the immediate result would be? I believe that it would be that the rest of the world would lean back and say, oh, fine, they took it for so and so many years. We don't have to deal with this for a number of years. We can relax, and it's the exact opposite we need. So just to end up this part saying this is no coincidence that we are not taking a second commitment period without conditions. Before I finish, I would just like to say a few things about the more sort of human side of this. Yesterday, in a Danish paper, I read this article, just to end up giving you an impression of what kind of challenges we are in for in the world of the 21st century. This article told that from 2001 until today, it's 10 years, the number of cars in the world grew from 500 million to 1 billion. The number of highways kilometers in China grew from 16,000 kilometers of highways to now 75,000 kilometers of highways. 2001, there we had 900 million cell phones in the world. Now we have 5.5 billion cell phones. And in 1 year, just in 1 year, we burn as much oil and coal as it has taken the Earth 5 million years to make. I mean, that is how you spell challenge. We must produce growth. We are becoming still more people. We need growth for these people. But it is pretty clear when you have statistics like this that we have to create a more sustainable kind of growth. In the 21st century, we must look beyond the traditional way of seeing growth as just sort of the traditional GDP. We must include environmental and social assets in companies and countries' balance sheets, and public authorities must put a price on pollution and carbon emissions to guide consumption and investment decisions in a sustainable direction. More generally, we must adjust our tax systems to align them better with public interest goals and our priorities as a society. I often summarize this as a matter of taxing more what you burn, tax less what we earn. In a century where we have got too little employment and too many emissions, it's really quite a paradox, isn't it, that we continue tax systems that tend to reflect exactly the opposite. in the coming decades, we will have to focus on universal access to efficient and renewable energy sources, on the sustainability of our agriculture and the global food chain, and we must improve the resilience and living quality of our cities. This is not just about the environment or climate change. The benefits of a green economy go far beyond that. Just a banal example, investing in cycle paths and public transport, for instance, not only cuts CO2 emissions, it also solves congestion problems and it improves air quality and people's health. Therefore, through this agenda, if we do it intelligently, it's actually possible to prove to people that a climate-friendly future, that is not about everything having to be gray and dull and black and you cannot do this and you must not do this. No, it can be intelligent, it can be creative, it can be a bright future. Actually, it is business as usual that risk creating a dark, dull and gray society. So just briefly to sum up, I believe that our economic system in Europe is capable of meeting the challenge, provided that we, policymakers, business community, scientists, set the right directions and provide the necessary tools. As the Singh Lord Gittins has also pointed out, this is fundamentally not a technical challenge, it is a political one. It is about mobilizing change and our capacity as a civilization to address joint challenges collectively. There is no more time to lose for the environment. And as greening our economy will also create new business opportunities and jobs and slash our energy bills, there is also no more time to lose for the economy. Business as usual cannot be the way forward. A greener growth has to be the way forward. Thank you very much.